Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second series in a series of webinars that the International Commission of Jurists Kenya will be hosting to discuss legal issues, human rights issues, and various other discourses that we'll be having. I wish to apologize for the alarms that are blaring in the background. There's nothing you can do about that, so we'll just wait. Thank you very much for coming on board. The second series in a series of webinars that the International Commission of Jurists Kenya will be hosting to discuss legal issues, human rights issues, and various other discourses that we'll be having. I see one of our panelists has joined in, Mr. Irungo Hudson. Irungo, if you can hear me, say something.
Hi, everybody, and I'm very glad to be here, despite the sound of the alarm in the background. It seems to have gone off now, which is great. Thanks, Mario, for the invitation.
We are waiting for a few other panelists to join in. I see Miss Betty Okera is on board. Hi, Betty, how are you? I think we are sorting out Betty's sound issues, so we will be right back with Betty. We are also joined by Patrick Karanja. He'll be joining us in this meeting. We have one of our panelists, Mr. Patrick Mutai. Patrick, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Thank you. You can switch on your camera so that we can see you.
I'm trying to maneuver this.
I understand it's a challenge for lawyers and technology. We are adapting appropriately. We're going to be joined by Wangare Kagai from the Law Society of Kenya. He will be joining us shortly. And also Dolal, the convener of the Social Justice Centers, he will be joining us shortly. As we wait for a few people to join, we have 59 people currently, and I can see that we have our Executive Director, Mr. Abdul Nur Mohammed, joining us. So with time, we will allow him to say a quick hello before we kick off the meeting. But I'm glad that we have most of our panelists ready. This webinar is informed by a series of talks that we have been having as civil society, as human rights practitioners around what is happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we thought that we can have exchanges even as we are strictly adhering to the government regulations of work from home, stay at home, social distancing. So we're here to talk about what's happening. And in particular, we want to talk about police and security actors and the state's responses to the whole quarantine issue. We understand that a lot of people are affected by this, and many have questioned what is the actual legal position of quarantine in this time. Is it that all laws have ceased to operate and now we are more or less in a public health pandemonium state? So we need to discuss this. We need to bring to the forefront. We need to highlight the issues. And I'm glad that we have very seasoned panelists. I know that Mr. Hirungo has been shedding light on the issues. And I hope that this will also be an opportunity for you to also highlight what some of the persons in quarantine are going through. Before we kick off the meeting, I want to do a quick thanks to the Lawyers Hub, to the CEO, Ms. Linda Bonyo. Thank you very much for hosting us as we continue with these discussions. We are really appreciative of the partnership that Lawyers Hub has with ICJ Kenya. And now to talk about a bit of ICJ. For those who do not know the International Commission of Jurists, ICJ Kenya is a member organization that was founded in 1959 and formally registered in 1974. The organization attracts membership from judges, magistrates, lawyers, human rights practitioners, and even student lawyers. So we have with us a panel and a pool of legal experts. The International Commission of Jurists works on a vast number of issues in human rights, democracy, international justice, and the rule of law. We have worked with the judiciary in various issues. We have also worked and partnered with police in the reforms agenda and also in finding ways to up their capacity in certain issues. We have collaborated very well with government and other stakeholders in ensuring that key policy is out. We have lent a hand to the National Legal Aid Service Board and Chair towards the development of the Legal Aid Act, as well as the Small Claims Court Act, and also the rules. So as ICJ, we are very keen on the legal processes, we're very keen on the legal documents that we do create, and we are very interested in the legal process. As ICJ, we have also been advocating for the rights of the most vulnerable in society. And for those vulnerable in society specifically, we have been working on a campaign on decriminalization of petty offenses because this targets the most vulnerable in our community, the hawkers, the street vendors, the loiterers, the persons who actually don't have a place of abode. And even during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have been monitoring the situation and how it affects those particular people. So that is an overview of what ICJ Kenya does. I am very happy to be hosting this conversation. And right now, I think I have most of my panelists on board. I can see that Mr. Happy Olal is trying to get in touch with us. So I will allow the panelists to introduce themselves as we sort out Mr. Happy Olal to ensure that he comes on board. So a quick round of introduction of our panelists to the membership that is already on board, what you do, where you're coming from, because not all of us are in Nairobi. So do tell us where you're tuning in from. I think we'll start with Mr. Irungu Hutton.
Thank you, Waria. My name is Irungu Houghton. I'm the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. I'm based in Nairobi, and for the last 6 weeks, Amnesty staff have been essentially tracking and advocating for the rights of people to essentially be free from police violence, but also for clarity within the public health guidelines, particularly related to mandatory quarantine.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, Irungu. I'll now move to Ms. Betty Okero.
Hi, everybody. My name is Betty Okero. I am working for an organization called CSO Network as a team leader. We currently have an ongoing program on access to justice, and we have used that to be able to track and monitor the number of violations that we have seen emerging, especially within the informal sectors. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Betty, for joining us from Kisumu. It's going to be an interesting discussion to find out the perspectives from the other parts of Nairobi. I know that most of us are here within the CBD, so it would be nice to know what's happening in other parts of Kenya. I'll now introduce Patrick to talk to us about who he is and where he comes from.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Mutahi. I'm in Nairobi. I'm a researcher at the Center for Human Rights and Policy Studies, which is a security governance policy think tank. And the work that I've been doing, I study about policing generally, but for this discussion, definitely I'll be talking much on what we are seeing as the outcome of the COVID response by the state in Kenya. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. And I see we have our final panelist, Mr. Happy Olal. Can you hear me, Happy? Mr. Olal, kindly unmute your microphone, please.
My name is Wilfred Olal. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Karibu sana.
Asante sana. My name is Happy Olal, the convener of the Social Justice Centers Working Group. And I'm excited to be here. We've also been monitoring the human rights situation in all the social justice centers across the country in 10 counties. So I'm happy to engage here. Asante sana.
Karibu sana. Thank you so much. I see we are joined with Wangari Kagai from the Law Society of Kenya. Ms. Kagai, karibu sana. Introduce yourself to the panelists and also tell us a bit about the Law Society of Kenya and what the responses are in this COVID-19 period. Ms. Kagai, your video is off. Would it be possible for you to turn it on and also unmute your microphone? Oh, there you are. Kindly unmute your microphone.
Hello. Can you hear
Hello.
me now? Hello.
Yes,
Can you hear me now?
yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the technological hitch. My computer decided to misbehave in the last minute. But my name is Wangari Kagai. I work for the Law Society of Kenya as the program officer in the public interest and advocacy department, public interest litigation and advocacy department, and I'm happy to be here. The Law Society of Kenya derives its mandate from the Law Society of Kenya Act. And relevant to this conversation is that one of its mandates is to protect members of the public and advise government and the courts on all matters incidental to the law. So I don't know if I should proceed or we.
I think because we have gotten a chance to know all our panelists, I will start by asking all our panelists to just, in as few words as possible, what has your experience been during the COVID-19 pandemic period? How are you working from home? How are your clients adjusting? How is life post-COVID? Let's start like that first.
I don't know if I can start off. So I found this period particularly taxing. I think I've gone from maybe 9 hour days to sometimes 12-hour days. It's difficult to switch off, and I had to take a day off yesterday just to breathe. I think just to reflect again on what was probably the most use of my time and the most use of my team's time. The Amnesty team continued to work. At the same time as we're on this call, we have a human rights course with up to 500 Kenyans who are interested in becoming human rights advocates. So we're doing our human rights education using the same tool as this one. We've spent quite a bit of time talking to patients and also families of people who have died in the context of violent policing. So our work continues, but of course restrained to the Nairobi County for those of us who are in this particular county.
Okay. All right. Mr. Mutai, how has your experience been?
I think it's been new. I've never been at a curfew ever in my life. So it's quite an interesting time, so to speak. And I think I was sharing with my colleagues, my friends, that these are new things that we've never experienced in our lifetime. Definitely very challenging in how to adjust into whatever situation we go with, either how to live with the COVID, how to negotiate with it, and essentially where do we go, from here? It's quite uncertain, definitely, but it's been quite an experience, so to speak.
Okay, all right. We lost you a bit there, but we caught the general gist that it's a challenging and nuanced experience for all of us. I'll now invite Mr. Olal to actually shed a bit of light on what life after COVID has been, especially with the context, bringing on board the perspectives of all the social justice centers, seeing as your convener. What are they saying? What is life post-COVID?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I hope I'm clear.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so life post-COVID has been extremely difficult with the social justice centers, because here we could not work from home, because once you tried working from home, all the cases now comes to your home. So we decided just to continue working from office, but just look at what measures can we put in place, make sure that we are safe. And it has been a very good and bad experience. Bad because we are working from mostly slums and informal settlements, where things like stay at home are very difficult to implement, because people work from daily wages. People depend on daily wages. The aspect of people washing hands is a challenge when there is no water. And the issue of police has been a serious problem. So for me, the experience has been, in fact, I've been working more than I used to work before COVID. because now all the cases are concentrated and people need action immediately. So it's not been a good experience, but we've enjoyed. Some of us love working, but we hope the situation will improve shortly so that people who are really suffering can go back and get their daily wage properly.
Right. Let's hear from Ms. Wangari Kagai. It's been a very busy period for the Law Society of Kenya post-COVID. So how are you doing? And also, how is working from home and working post-COVID?
On my part, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting experience working from home. Of course, it's new for most of us. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And we can see you.
Okay. So as I was saying, it's an interesting experience. It's new. And we are rolling with the punches, basically. It's a very busy time for the Law Society of Kenya because human rights violations are on the rise. The need for legal aid is more critical than ever. So working from home, like other speakers have stated, has been probably busier than working as usual from the office. The challenges that we've faced, obviously, are communication challenges. We are not able to receive cases very effectively because most people, citizens are limited insofar as how well they can communicate. Some of them do not have the means or the technical savvy to interact via telecoms or forums such as this webinar. So we are doing the best we can under the circumstances and hoping that we can rise to the occasion and assist members of the public at this very crucial moment. Okay. That's my experience, yes.
All right, thank you very much. And our last but not certainly least panelist, Ms. Okero, kindly tell us how it's been working from home, working outside Nairobi, and the experience post-COVID.
Suddenly, it has been new, unusual. Apart from the fact that we have longer hours, one of the things that's become very clear is that we don't have such things called lunches or lunch break now when you're at home. You just keep working endlessly. The other thing also is that apart from that, personally, you also find yourself working sometimes even past midnight because, your whole program has changed. Whereas before we knew we had an 8 to 5, now you find yourself working even beyond midnight. Trying to get a balance is becoming difficult. I think for me, the other thing also is that, there's a whole reconnection with family. The ones that you're living with in the house and the ones that you don't get to see. And you're then starting to put in place some sort of, relationship building that's going on, putting in place commitments on how you want to engage. And I think for me, finally, is the fact that I'm also learning that I really didn't know.
Sorry, I think we have lost Ms. Okero for a minute there. Let's try get her back.
The extent of the sort of challenges that people are. Sorry, did I disappear?
Just for a bit, but we'll be back.
Okay, so I'm not sure what you missed out. I think what I was saying finally was that I'm starting to actually get to know very well the people we've been engaging with as an organization, particularly the HRD community. Having these conversations with them and just figuring out how everybody is doing, one gets to realize just how much we've taken for granted. And so just starting to realize how vulnerable people are, it has created an opportunity for people to be able to come clean or to open up in ways that is so profound. So it's different, a lot of work, but then also an opportunity to innovate and question and reflect a lot, as an individual, as an organization, in terms of the program that we're doing. It is helping us, it's helping me to sort of ask myself some serious questions about, what I'm doing, how I can add value, whether what I've been doing matters, how it is that I need to improve the work that I'm involved in.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much to my panelists for sharing your experiences, from sharing how you have adapted to the new normal, and explaining and rather shedding a bit of light about how your various organizations are working during this period. Now we will start the conversation that is at hand, which is what is happening in our quarantine centers and this new trend that has become the police using quarantine centers as places of detention to some extent, because we understand, and before we actually go any further, I wish to categorically state that as ICJ, as Lawyers Hub, as a civil society fraternity, we do appreciate the measures that the government has put in force to protect our lives, to protect the public health of all citizens in this great nation. And we are also cognizant that these guidelines are also a reflection of the WHO guidelines that have also been set out. So we appreciate the various rules and regulations in place. What now we are discussing is various challenges that have arisen from the implementation of said guidelines and rules. So I know that a lot of people will ask, what is the balance and how do we create that balance? But for us, we are here to have a discussion on how to create that balance, find solutions, mutually find solutions to those challenges that we are having. And most particularly, and at the back of all our minds, appreciating the essential services that are offered by our medics, by our police, by our firefighters, by our various entities that are still working during this period. So even as we have this discussion, at the back of our minds, we are cognizant and appreciative of the various efforts of essential services. So that goes without saying. I also wanted to say that you can follow this conversation on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and kindly retweet, post, ask questions. Our hashtag for this conversation is hashtag police brutality KE, at ICJ Kenya, at Amnesty International, at the Social Justice Centers, it'll at Uhai Kenya. Betty will share with me the hashtag for the CSO network, at Law Society of Kenya. So engage the various panelists in this discussion. So now we are on the table discussing police brutality and state responses, quarantine as the new detention. First of all, what does this message mean to you in your various spheres of work? For Mr. Mutai, as a research fellow, what does this mean to you?
Thank you very much. I think looking at the whole question about quarantine as the new detention, it speaks to how, what I can say that how the interpretation, it's interesting from where I'm sitting, that the interpretation of the directives in terms of management of the COVID-19 have really been changed or been interpreted in a way that they no longer being used much as something to govern the health issue, but now being tacked much more to a security issue. And this really is I think is why that sentiment when when the cessation of movement was declared by the president. And I remember the jokes that were going around and people saying, actually, they don't care much what the president has said. They're just concerned with how the police are going to interpret the presidential statements. And that really speaks to the kind of thinking that we are seeing, looking at how the police then, because they have been moved in to come and manage a health issue, and their management of this is moving from not that it's supposed to be less stigmatized, to help people recover, or even to ensure that people don't infect each other. But what we have seen is more movement to harder restrictions, the mentality that what we need to do is to lock down people, yet yet the police were supposed to help in the facilitation, and also for people to continue living, even if it's in a more restricted manner, but in a manner that is safe. But some of what obviously that we are seeing is the whole thinking is much more of a securitized thinking, and this is worrying because we still, I think, we still don't know how much of this securitization or this quarantine mode of management of the health issue has really led it to increase the numbers within the centers where the people are being held, and definitely it's something that that I think needs to be addressed more. And possible also to reflect on this is the case that that the LSK had taken to court, and I remember reading the the ruling, and the judge was saying that he couldn't understand how why the curfew and people have to get permits from the police to move, yet within that the written permission is that there's no a medical officer or someone to really ascertain on some of these movement issues. And that really also thinks to the interpretation of the public order, the public order that talked about the state curfew, that what from the onset, the whole thinking was about putting people together, in the quarantine issue. And this, I think, as we continue even living out the situation, is something that that we'll need to interrogate further. If we are to get another pandemic, we have already started this, seeing that this is how we can manage public order, and then what does that really mean for the country?
Okay.
So,
Thank you very much, Patrick. I understand that CRISP has been doing a bit of data and research as regards how the applicability of laws is in this particular time. Do you mind shedding a bit of light on the disparities in the application of law during COVID-19 and in the informal settlements in particular?
Yes, I can highlight a bit of that. And I think this is to say that one of the things, and again, this is not something that is we could be very proud of, is to say that we've the police response was not unexpected, because the kind of management of public order that we have seen all along is the police that do not take it to facilitate people's movement, and that's why we saw the issues that were happening either in Likoni or even other towns in Nairobi, in the informal settlements and all that. So it's not unexpected. It's just unfortunate that all the years down, that the police have not moved on from seeing citizens as people, as citizens. So that's the first thing. The second thing that definitely is that we which have obviously confirmed part of our research is on the thinking on the management of the public order. In last year, we did a survey among Nairobi police officers, and the questions we're asking them on how are they trained, how do they go out to manage either the street protests, and all that. And the glaring issue that came out was one, they're not all of them who go to the streets are trained about public order management. So all of you are called from the different stations, come to one central place, and then you're supposed to go to a certain area. Definitely that poses many problems, because public order, how to de-escalate situations, is a skill that people learn. Is something that you're supposed to practice all along. The second thing that really came out a lot is the mentality of that people, you can only manage order through force. And part of the sentiments that came was, that's the only way that Kenyans know how to be managed is by force. And now, speaking of this COVID, part of what we, part of the research that we have done, and talking to the police officers, then part of the sentiments were again that Kenyans ni vichwa ngumu. It's a language that came out from some of the people that we talked to, and we are trying to find out why continue with this. And yet that language is something that is very much seems to be ingrained within the policing culture of order. The third thing that, to respond to your question, is there's a lot of, as of yesterday evening, we had counted 8 executive orders, 15 legal notices issued, so many other directives and circulars, issued by different institutions of government, from the judiciary to the ministries themselves. The county governments are also issuing their own orders. And really this then, to us, there's quite a lot of confusion on what is to be followed. There seems to be quite an incoherence, everyone trying to do something. And this really then speaks to how then are we managing not even the directives coming up, but also the people who are going to implement. And that confusion obviously plays within the application of the different rules. And this was really seen when we started, when it was not very clear if you're arrested in the curfew hours, then what happens to you? The courts are not working. Are you managed at the police station? And then that also brings other confusions because it creates more avenues for corruption within the police. And also there's very little of now the judicial oversight, mechanisms because there's little that is going on there. Right. And lastly is to speak about one of the provisions. I think there's this one about that in the legal notice number 49, the one about the public health, prevention, control, suppression of the COVID. When about the costs that are to be catered for. Yes. Yes, we have seen the national government saying that they are not going to, to cater for the costs. But interestingly, Mombasa county government has come up and said that they're actually going to cover the costs for people who are quarantined within Mombasa. And this then speaks to, and this is the last issue that I'll speak to, about health being a devolved function, vis-a-vis seeing it being as a security issue. So we have two dynamics here of some of the people seeing it as a security issue, and that's why you're quarantined at your own cost as a punishment. Yet we have the county government of Mombasa treating it, yes, it's a health issue, we'll cater for your bills, and this helps people, to continue with life as difficult as it has been. And this tension also speaks to, remember when we had the discussions in 2010, 2013 about, is security a national function? Or is it going to be devolved? And for us as a research center, what we have ever held is that there are different dimensions of security issue, and the COVID has really brought this out. That security is more than the police. There are too many other elements that the counties can do, and I think this is very much vivid now.
All right, thank you very much for those insights. I can already see reactions from our question and answer section. Do engage with us, put your questions there. I'm already seeing questions from Mary Wangai, questions from Lucas Kimathi, questions from Mary, also questions from, I think I saw questions from Edwin, yes, Edwin to the panelists. So panelists, as you go through your presentations, also look at the Q&A section because there are certain questions that have been put there by the people who we are engaging. We currently have 110 attendees, and we hope to continue and also get more people on board. But in the meantime, panelists, do check that side and ensure that you are noting the questions that are being asked by various participants. So in your presentation, Patrick, you have actually mentioned something that is very important, which is on security, and whether this is a security issue and the over-policing of informal settlements. And I want to bring on board Mr. Happy Olal, who is the convener of the Social Justice Centers, to talk about what is actually happening in the informal settlements in regards to policing, in regards to arrests for those who are in contravention of the guidelines that have already been put in place, and also to highlight what is the procedure that is happening to those who are arrested, because I understand that as a community justice actor, when many people are arrested, they call to you, they reach out to you. So what has been the process? Kindly shed a bit of light of what's happening. Thank you. Mr. Olal?
Yeah, so we've been documenting, as I said earlier, and what I can say is that when the Chief Justice gave out the directive that the courts are not going to operate fully, he said that most of the cases will be handled at the police stations, and the Inspector General was supposed to to give some guidelines. And as I speak, I don't know if it's me who has not seen the guideline. I don't know if that was done. And that has given the police an open check, a blank check to do whatever they want. Yesterday, our team visited the police station here at the Dandora police station. You could just see people, a lot of people in the cell. There was no social distancing. And my fear personally is that the people will spread this disease most is the police because of the way they handle themselves and the way they handle suspects. So what happens in informal settlements as we speak is if you don't have a mask, you will be arrested. And it doesn't matter whether the police have a mask or not. In fact, most of them don't, but they arrest people for not having masks. Even have members of the social justice centers who have been arrested because of that. And it has been very, very sad. And the aspect of one part of the government, which is the executive, working, and the other two parts of the government says that they can't work, has removed the balance. So you find that even most of these legal notices and the rules that the government is coming up with, they don't have a check and balance from the parliament. And the judiciary is not there to see if there is any excesses. So that is a serious challenge. Both of them need that balance of the government where we have the judiciary working, the executive working, and legislature working. On our case, since the first day of curfew, personally and the team have monitored 15 killings as a result of the police. 15 people have lost their lives because Uhuru Kenyatta declared a curfew in this country. And the question we've been asking ourselves is that, are we fighting the citizens or we are fighting the disease? You cannot fight a disease with the rungu and nyaunyo. The number of people who've been injured. Sorry?
No, sorry, we are wait, but you're back.
Okay, sorry. The number of people who've been injured by police, we have lost count because they are in all the counties. Every county are facing challenges with police every night, including last night. Some people were beaten by police or in some parts of this country. So it's been a serious challenge with the issue of police accountability. And we think it's something that we really need to follow through. Because we have people, now they have brought in the aspect of when you are arrested outside curfew hours, you are supposed to be taken to a quarantine center. So that who is supposed to effect that is the same police. So what has happened in these estates and the slums is that the bribe has gone up. So it's either you give us a certain amount of money or we take you to a quarantine center. So the bribe used to be between 3,000-5,000. Now it has gone up to 15,000 to 30,000 if you are a team, a group. So I think we need a very clear legal mechanism. And for me personally, I still think we need our courts so that we have people who can run to courts, because the police cannot be the judiciary. They cannot do everything. We need our courts, even if it's open air courts, we need to find a way. But we cannot continue the way we are. People are losing their lives. Many people, you go to these major hospitals, I know of people who are there because of being beaten by police. Go to Mama Lucy right now. You'll get people. Go to hospitals across the country. So we've lost focus on why we are doing the curfew. It should be because we are fighting the coronavirus. You'll find most people even put on their masks, not because they fear. It's no longer because they disease. It's because let me put on my mask so that I don't meet the police. And once we start losing focus like that, then we are no longer fighting the disease. It's no longer the intended cause, but it's a very very sad situation. So all the Chief Justice has been giving a lot of details, but when it comes to Mashinani, come to Huruma Police Station, Dandora, it's like those things don't exist here. You are arrested, you can stay up to 4 days as you wait for your family to fundraise, to raise the money that the police want. So I think in terms of monitoring, and it's sad that the human rights aspect was not put as an essential service. It could have helped, but we need to work with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights and IPOA so that they can help in monitoring the police stations because they have that mandate. They should just go randomly to these stations. I think that can help, and we can help the situation because people are really suffering out here. And as we speak, we've also lost 3 members. One is a social justice center member from Kiamaiko Social Justice Center who disappeared on Friday. So his name is Michael Njau. They just disappeared on Friday evening, and he had his cousin Adan Mohammed and a taxi driver Samuel Mungai. So what we have also experienced is the increase in these disappearances in Kiamaiko alone. The last 2 weeks, we've had 7 cases of disappearances, and 4 of them were found dead at the mortuary. We are still hoping that our comrade and his colleagues will be found safe. So that is the situation in the ground. It's not looking good at all. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Olal. I'm looking at the comments, I'm looking at the question and answer section, and I appreciate Madam Sarapai's comment that there is a misconception that the courts are not working. And I understand that a lot of citizens right now are not getting to the courts. They might be working, but a lot of citizens are not getting to the courts. And these are some of the questions that I will be posing to Ms. Wangare Kagai in a few minutes in regards to what is the access to justice question during this quarantine period, because a lot of citizens need legal services. I know the Law Society of Kenya has gone to court to ask that lawyers are gazetted as legal essential services during this period. And unfortunately, we won the case, but it has been appealed. So I know that there is an ongoing process in regards to getting lawyers as essential services, but more importantly, what is the criminal justice procedure for persons who are arrested during this COVID-19 period? Are they arraigned before court within 24 hours, as is their right in the Constitution?
Thank you, Wayua. And thank you for the panelists who have spoken before me. I'm sorry, I'll just have to do this via audio because I'm experiencing some technical hitches, but to answer your question, what the procedure is presently as prescribed by the NCAJ guidelines is that people who are arrested for minor offenses are presently being offered bail and bond terms at police station level for minor offenses, that is in free bond for those who cannot be able to afford the bail terms, and released. And this directive was issued on the premise of avoiding crowding of accused persons in cells to curb the spread of the infection. So that was the rationale for it when it was initially proposed, or rather when the guidelines were developed. So what has been happening so far is, just as I've said, those who are arrested for minor offenses, or what ideally should be happening is that those arrested for minor offenses are given bail terms and are told to present themselves in court, whether remotely or physically, depending on the judicial officer handling the matter or the court, and what measures have been put in place to ensure the safety of those that are arraigned. And for capital offenses or serious offenses, those arrested are required to be held in police stations and cells and arraigned within 24 hours as per the Constitution. The rights of an arrested person have not been suspended. We know they're enshrined under Article 49, which article was necessitated by the violations that used to occur previously under the post-colonial eras when regimes used to detain people without trial. And so as of now, all accused persons are still required to be arraigned in court within 24 hours for serious offenses. And this is happening both virtually because of the safety concerns and the directives on social distancing, depending on the court, or physically. So that is the situation presently. Now, we have witnessed quite a number of scenarios. We've received a lot of data from the ground through human rights defenders such as Happy Olal and the social justice working groups, and even through CSOs, informing us that, of course, there are so many violations that are taking place currently. And one example is what we've seen via social media. So many people reporting that they have been arrested, not even put in cells, not even held there and arraigned, not given any bail and bond terms, but immediately, presented to quarantine facilities as a form of punishment if they're not able to agree in courts with the police, with the arresting officers. And this has been challenged. Of course, it is unlawful from the onset. There's no directive that has been issued that has stipulated that any arrested person should be put under quarantine as a measure to curb the spread of COVID. So this is a misinterpretation, or it's a lacuna. It's something that has been taken advantage of by the enforcement officers, I think, in order to, our culture with corruption and everything. I think some of these police officers are taking advantage of the ambiguity in this during this crisis to gain some financial benefit from subjecting people to quarantine facilities, just as Happy has pointed out. And there's not only the enforcement agencies, but also some owners or some of the proprietors of the quarantine facilities that stand to gain commercial benefit. So what the LSK has done so far, in fact, even from the beginning, we first instituted a petition in court, number 78 of 2020, where we were seeking for orders that the government suspend non-essential flights. The upholding of protection of the rights of citizens began very early for the Law Society of Kenya, when we saw that there's a risk of spread of the virus to our citizens, and that the inbound flights were still landing in Kenya, exposing citizens to infection. We went to court, instituted petition 78, and orders were granted suspending or banning non-essential flights. However, unfortunately, the virus still found its way into our territory, and then the president, of course, issued guidelines, directive on curfew soon after to curb the spread of the virus. Now, the imposition of this curfew raised now other legal challenges, and LSK went to court, first of all, challenging the constitutionality of that curfew, because the Gazette notice was not very clear on how the curfew would be implemented. We petition 120 of 2020 also sought a declaration that use of unreasonable force in enforcing the curfew is unconstitutional, because on the first day of the curfew enforcement, we saw gross human rights violations in Mombasa at the Likoni Ferry, the murder of Yasin Juma at Karioko by a police officer who used a live bullet to enforce the curfew. We also saw numerous cases. We received numerous cases via our hotline, which we set up immediately to also respond to the distress calls that were occurring due to human rights violations. And that's when we instituted petition 120, which Judge Weldon Korir pronounced himself and said that enforcement using unreasonable force is unconstitutional, and that is the position that stands to this day. After that, the President and the Ministry of Health under Cabinet Secretary Mutahi Kagwe set out offenses and penalties under the Public Health Act. And the LSK again went to court to challenge the constitutionality of these rules. Given that public participation was not conducted, it's unconstitutional. You cannot set out rules and under a statute that go contrary to the Constitution. And furthermore, these rules we were questioning, we were interrogating whether they were tabled before the Committee to Delegated Legislation. So we were questioning the legality of these rules in the first place under that petition as well. And we were also seeking orders that the government provide masks for free to the citizens, because it set out not wearing masks as an offense under those rules. And yet we know very well that not many Kenyans can be able to afford the masks, because they range from 50 to 100 bob. Most Kenyans live from hand to mouth. 50 shillings is a very high cost just to procure a mask that cannot even be recycled. So we were asking the government to provide free masks to the citizens to complement the directive that they issued, requiring everybody to wear a mask in public spaces. That case is still ongoing, so we cannot really delve into the details of it, but those are some of the steps that the LSK has taken in order to protect or to uphold the rule of law and protect human rights, and also cure some of the lacunas that have been left open and are susceptible to abuse by the enforcement agencies. We also, in fact, have written access to information letters asking the IGP to provide to issue guidelines to enforcement officers, defining the parameters within which they are supposed to enforce this curfew, and holding them to account where they breach the same. We are engaging with IPOA and the Internal Affairs Unit of the police just to hold them to account or put them to task to discipline the police officers and to basically ensure that they follow whichever directives that have been issued to the letter and without interfering with the rights of arrested persons. So in a nutshell, the LSK has done a lot. We are also doing legal aid. We are still documenting the offenses, and we're going to compile a report, which we are going to present to the IGP, the IPOA, and all other duty bearers, even the DCI, to investigate the errant officers that have been carrying out these violations and hold them to account. So in a nutshell, the Law Society of Kenya completely disagrees with the manner of enforcement that has been witnessed so far. Insofar as enforcement of curfew through forced quarantine, it is unlawful, is unconstitutional, and we are taking all the necessary steps to ensure that the same is addressed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Kagai. We appreciate the sentiments. We understand that the judiciary has issued the NCAJ guidelines, practice directions, and has actually addressed itself to how courts will be conducted during this COVID-19 period. However, the implementation of that has not been as smooth as we would have intended it, especially on the criminal side. So we are appreciative of the Law Society of Kenya's efforts to go to court to challenge a few of the ways that these things are being implemented. And something that many people are talking about on social media right now is the mental impact that quarantine is having on people. Being arrested and then put into forced quarantine. What is the mental impact to the person? What is the social economic impact to the family of the person who is arrested and then detained? Because more often than not, when someone is arrested, their family doesn't know where they are. So they're arrested, detained, and then taken to a quarantine center, and thereafter given a bill to pay. And you find that this is very unfortunate for most families who did not have a budget of this sort. So I'm looking through the questions, and I am seeing that a lot of people are raising the same thing. What is the mental health of the people who are put under quarantine? Why are they being told to pay for their own institutionalizing? I mean, putting them within the quarantine centers, why are they being told to pay for that? And I want to bring on board Ms. Betty Okero to talk about this, and also in tandem with GBV. And we've noted that during this quarantine period, there have been reports to the fact that there might be an increase in gender-based violence during this period. And you find that where people are afraid to even leave their houses because of the threat of quarantine, how then will they be able to get the legal services, to get help? How is this quarantine affecting women and girls across this nation?
Thanks, Waiwa. So yes, certainly there is sadly an increase in SGBV cases. And most of it, of course, usually happens, especially once the curfew sets in, and then people are not supposed to be able to move out. What is emerging right now is the presence of the provincial administration in terms of the chiefs and the role that they are playing. But even for a number of people who are seeking or who wish to seek for medical attention, it becomes a challenge because the first person you have to confront with is the police. And with it comes the need for you to justify that you actually need help or that you are actually going to pursue medical assistance. I think one of the things that we have seen is that it is not unique to only women. We've seen, cases that have gone viral where even doctors who have cards have been beaten to a pulp because they were out after 7. So I think what's becoming really quite obvious is that the cops have zero respect for whether you have the right to be out there and whether you're considered an essential service, because for them that does not hold. So if you are, just before I came here, I had a session with the GBVRC Center. And one of the things that came out was that they've been handling, at least on average, close to 4 cases a day. And that's from last week. And they says there has been a spike since, we put in place the curfew. A lot of domestic violence is suddenly rife. A lot of cases of men who need counseling, stress and anxiety. There's also been a spike in children defilement cases. And this is just within the urban center. They're talking about also an increase in teenage pregnancies that is also being witnessed. Now, when you talk about issues around mental health, and I hear everybody talk about mental health in the quarantine area, perhaps one of the things we have to start asking ourselves is, do we start questioning the mental health of the people who are actually mandated to carry out orders? What is the state of the mental health of the police sector? So that we start also engaging on issues about trying to address the sort of trauma that one can see projected on citizens. But I just want to take us back to sort of ask ourselves, why are we in this place? Right from the beginning, there are 2 issues that have come out very clearly. The government has dealt with issues around public information in terms of the laws that they give and public education in terms of the punitive action that is taken once the public information is out. That we are handling a medical health situation in a way in which we want to control and quash citizens' movements. We do that in the most traumatic of ways. There is no need, there is no negotiation. But yet Mombasa has proved to us, just as Patrick was saying, that it is possible that county governments can actually engage and make sure that we're not sort of witnessing the sort of battering that's going on. The other question that one must ask is, how has the absence of our political leaders, those that we have elected, their absence and invisibility helped to reinforce the sort of violations that we're seeing so prevalent, and that they are helpless around how to do this, and yet we know that they can actually work on it. Now, when you start talking about issues around gender and gender-based violence, when you go to the police officer, especially when you have cases where the police officer is accused of assaulting, because we have police officers, some of who in Kisumu actually go into people's houses, rain into people's houses and start assaulting them. At that point, one is not clear what it is, what law it is that the citizens have broken. But there's a general law that because you have 4 or 5 people outside, you therefore are going to chase people right inside their houses. Last night, they were throwing tear gas in Kisumu because they decided that was the way they could mobilize people to sort of get into the house because it was curfew time. Now, these actions that one is seeing result in all manner of violations. For a number of the women and girls, it's the invisible injustice that we're dealing with now, which is the occurrence of rape. We have set up quarantine centers that were supposed to protect citizens against transmission. But yet in those centers, you do have people who say that they have never been tested. There are certain places where they were saying they were in there for more than 10 days and they were being tested on the 12th day. And then because they discovered that 2 or 3 people may have been positive in that lot, they then extended the quarantine a little bit more. There is no psychologist. You're sitting there and the idea is you're quarantined and you're isolated. And the only relationship between me and you is that I need to test you to make sure that you're negative. So the management of COVID in this country is one where you are protecting not the citizens themselves because you don't put in place systems that ensure that you're actually protecting them. The current, quarantine methods that are being used, where we now have decided that it's a form of punishment, does not in any way endear to the public information that was put in place. We don't have psychologists in those centers. Nobody has talked about psychologists in those centers. And for me, one of the questions that I have to ask myself is, so who are we talking to? Who are we talking with? The cases that we're talking about now, and if you just look at all the comments that are coming in, we have been saying this thing since it started. Somebody tell me, which government officer has ever responded to the issues that we are raising? Why is the state so quiet when we can see? It is there, we are recording it. We can see the violence that is taking place. It is documented, it is reported, and yet the state continues to ignore all this information that is coming out. And you have to ask yourself, who is COVID supposed to protect? Because what we see is that the people have become the enemy. But who are the people the enemy of? And is that the reason why we're not taking into consideration some of the pleas, some of the cries, some of the violations that are taking place? But is it possible for us to be able to reclaim this? And for me, the answer is yes. And we've started seeing that citizens are saying it is not fair. I think one of the, the viral videos that went out yesterday where a police officer thought that they could arrest somebody for not wearing a mask and they were not wearing a mask themselves and eventually had to release it. We must be able to see a lot more citizens starting to police the actions where the police themselves are breaking the law. But in terms of responding to GBVRC, the county government needs to come in to be able to ask themselves, why do we have GBVRC only operating until 6? Because some of the cases that are coming in are after. How do we then create an enabling environment for every single person who wants to report those cases to be able to visit those GBVRC centers? And how does the county government support those GBVRC centers to provide the essential services that are necessary for the women who are also accessing justice? Now, in terms of how to ensure that the police stations also become an enabling environment for reporting, we then have to ask ourselves, how do those desks, how do those reporting stations become friendly to people? Because there are cases that are not being reported for the simple reason being that it is not friendly to report, especially when you're saying that the violation has been caused by the police. The emergence of the provincial administration in managing security is another issue that we must be able to start questioning and addressing. Because where the provincial administration is the one that's now taking charge of public order, then what is the role of the National Police Service when it comes to accountability of the violations that we're now witnessing?
Thank you very much, Betty. Indeed, we need to also consider the fact that whereas we want to be able to get out and report cases, where are we reporting those cases? Who are we reporting to those cases? And I feel like you have hit the nail on the head. Are we creating safe spaces? I mean, there's an ongoing worldwide discussion around the need to have safe spaces for victims of domestic violence, for victims of gender-based violence across the world, because people need somewhere to go. But as a nation, unfortunately, we did not preempt this and we did not plan for this. So once again, we're in a situation where even if you report, where do you go? Are you even safe being taken to a quarantine center? Because that would be the next point of detachment. Can you be taken from your home and taken to a quarantine center? That is not an option. So really, we find that we are in incredible times. We're living in incredible times. And I want Mr. Irungu Hutton, as you join into this conversation, to shed a light on, is this a Kenyan phenomena? Are we witnessing only a Kenyan situation with the quarantine issue, with the mandatory quarantine? Are police across the world being better at what they're doing in enforcing curfews and lockdowns and isolation mechanisms? Because many feel like maybe this is just a Kenyan situation, but maybe because we are not tapping into what's happening around the world, it is actually worse out there. And also, in light of what you've heard from the other participants, 15 lives is far too many to lose in the fight against COVID in a non-COVID related death. What do you have to say about that? Because I know Amnesty International was at the forefront of developing the Police Reforms Working Group statement when we spoke about the enforcement of the curfew on the very first day of this curfew. So over to you, Irungu. Kindly respond to a few of the highlighted issues.
I think the first question is this different from what else is happening in the world? And I think the answer to that, based on Amnesty's kind of work in different countries, is that no, it's not. Many countries are experiencing rise in GBV, the rise in police violence, and a public health response that is not anchored in constitutionalism and in law. Of course, for Kenya, we have not gone the state of emergency route. We have gone a public health order route. And I think that's an important distinction to make, that at this time for Kenya, the constitution has not been suspended. It is not set aside. And therefore, all the rights and freedoms that are there that are not touched on by these public health guidelines and the various executive orders still remain and therefore need to be protected. And for some of those executive orders, they need to be challenged, where they do not either, they're not framed in a concept of proportionality to the threat that we face from the pandemic. Specifically, I think for Kenya, we have grappled with, well, this pandemic was always going to be managed through two axes. And I think the responsibility of activists and lawyers and good people is to make sure that we move towards one of the axes rather than the other. And those axes are essentially, on one side, it is inequality, corruption, and the criminalization of people living in poverty. And then the other axis is command responsibility, respect for human rights, and public trust. And I think that's the battle. So in between those two axes is where I think we have to give our energies to focus on. Obviously, I think, as people have said, police violence is the most unsophisticated tool in the arsenal of a state. Policing the pandemic at this time is currently the primary risk rather than the secondary risk for many African countries, including Kenya. Many more people have died as a result of unlawful and excessive use of force than the pandemic itself. And I think this has to keep occupying our attention until the government gets it right and the police are essentially restrained from using this time either for private profiteering or for abuse of people's rights. The biggest challenge, besides violent policing, has to be the discriminatory access to healthcare. And let me turn now to the second part of your question, which is really a question around the management of the mandatory quarantine centers. For Kenya, I think we have to see this in terms of two waves. The first wave was essentially mandatory quarantine for people who had come from outside the country. And the second wave is the wave that we are currently moving into, which is mandatory quarantine for those people who are locally, who have been locally infected. And the class character of those who are being quarantined has dramatically changed in many ways. So in the first phase, you had 2,000 people, many of whom were elected to go into hospitals and, sorry, not hospitals, but into hotels and other facilities that they could afford. And for those that couldn't, they elected to go for public quarantine centers. And what we've seen from particularly the public quarantine centers is that they were poorly managed, they were recklessly supervised, there was no personal public personal protective equipment for either the people managing those facilities, nor for the patients themselves. And I use the word patients lightly because many of them were not people with COVID-19. They were essentially people who were set aside to see whether they would manifest with the virus. There was no physical distancing. I think many of us saw the beds in Lenana school that were less than 1 meter apart. And there was very little information that was given to people as they arrived. I mean, many people didn't know which centers they were going to, even if they made the choice between a private or a public facility, they were not told which private institutions they were going to. Some of the cases, for example, with Pride Inn, the 3 detention centers or the 3 quarantine centers, they didn't even know what the costs were going to be immediately, and there was some confusion whether the government would take on those costs. So I think as we move into the second wave of mandatory quarantine, we've seen the impact. Not only has the police officers begun to see this as an opportunity to extort bribes, but essentially they have arrogated to themselves. And I want to disagree with one of the panelists earlier. The police do not have the legal framework to inter people in mandatory quarantine. That responsibility, if you look at the public health guidelines, Article 2, Article 3.1, and various others, that prerogative remains, that power remains with public health workers within the Ministry of Health. It is not a police function in this day and age to decide who has COVID-19 and who may have come in contact with a COVID-19 patient. That responsibility has to lie with public health officers. So the officers that, the police officers that have been pushing people into these mandatory quarantine centers, like the like Echo, the story of Echo that happened just recently, they are breaking the law and they need to be held accountable for breaking the law. So I'll stop there and continue the conversation on the question and answer. And just thank you very much for this opportunity to continue engaging in different spaces, both as a panelist, but also as a participant. I will stay on for another 15 minutes, but unfortunately I will have to leave at 1:30. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much, Irungu, for your insights. I think it's important for us to also know who's participating in this webinar. So I have seen Madam Jill Guy from the Katiba Institute, Louise Edwards from South Africa, Temfung from Senegal, and most importantly, our chairperson, Mr. Kevin Mogeni. Thank you very much for being with us as we discuss this important conversation. I think we also need to then now delve into the legality of the issue. I think you've pointed it out, Irungu, very well. Is forced quarantine after arrest legal? I think we need to ask that question and answer it categorically. Is forced arrest after quarantine legal? What is the procedure that should be followed? Should the arrested person be brought before the courts, following which detained for a period to assess whether they have been in contact with persons who have COVID-19? I think this lacuna and this lack of clarity is what has unfortunately been used to circumvent the legal process. So I think that's what we should answer. Is the process, what is the right process? So I'll just ask Irungu just to comment on that, because I know you have to step out. So let's comment on that a bit.
I think I've raised this issue in terms of the public health guidelines, and I would really ask the lawyers here present to interrogate those public health guidelines very closely so that we can actually begin to mount a legal challenge on this issue. The challenge has, I think, the broader challenge in terms of the courts at the time, as we saw with the LSK judgment, or rather successful judgment from the courts on the admission of lawyers and advocates as essential and critical services, is that the executive are ignoring those judgments. And I think there are two levels we look at this. One is to see how we can get public pressure to cause the kind of reaction that we saw, for example, after the death of Yasin Moyo and the 13-year-old boy from Kiamaiko, that the uproar from members of the public and international headlines is what caused the presidential apology. It is, I think in some ways public pressure at this point is critical. But the second thing I think is also documentation of cases. COVID will come and go. We will be in a post-COVID situation, touch wood, by the end of the year. And all of these cases of injustice can be followed up at that point. So I think that would be my challenge back to the lawyers at this moment. State officers have an obligation to do no harm and a duty of care to all of us. And I think putting, crowding people into mandatory quarantine centers that have no semblance of the standards that were set up by the WHO is clearly something that can be actionable, not just now, but in future.
Thank you very much, Irungu. I'm now looking at the question and answer section that is very vibrant. I can see a lot of people giving their views. I see George Alambo stating that some police posts and stations have turned to enterprises. If you question what is happening, straight you are taken to mandatory quarantine. Nick Omito says, what happens to people arrested haphazardly for not wearing masks on the road? Their medical condition notwithstanding, where some of them are dragged to quarantine, yet they're on medication. I have also seen comments from an anonymous attendee stating that if I am alone in the car, should I mandatorily wear a mask? I see a lot of engagement, and I wanna allow a few of the people to call in and discuss this. I'm going to invite Martin Mavenjina from the Kenya Human Rights Commission to just posit your questions to the panelists. Mavenjina, if you're with us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for convening this panel. And I want to thank all the panelists for the great presentations that they made. I just have one question that I'd raised, and I'll just pose it to all the panelists. So state security agencies have been using enhanced surveillance capabilities to track COVID-19 patients or people they have interacted with. And in doing so, they have infringed on privacy rights of many citizens. So in light of this, how can we hold these security agencies to account for breaching privacy rights? So that question is to all the panelists.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Mavenjina. Panelists, I think we're going to look at two questions and probably take those from the chat that I think we should address here. Mr. Rapai, thank you very much. I'm seeing your comment. Amnesty International is trailblazing, commendable, multi-pronged advocacy with limited circumstances. Let more HRDs take you. Kudos to Mr. Irungu and the team. I think Mr. Rapai is amazed by your work. There are a few comments here. I have seen, if I could scroll up a bit, give me a minute. Mr. Suba, he has said that I have just watched a few minutes ago Boniface Mwangi trying to intervene in a situation in Korogosho where police officers attached to Korogosho police post arrested a group of young men who were reportedly not wearing masks at a Chang'ad den. The number of such cases is ongoing and is increasing across the country. These are some of the issues that are happening. Yesterday, I think in Kisumu, we saw that a police officer tried to effect an arrest to a person but was not wearing a mask. And you find that the society is generally resistant to such. So in a bid to work together to ensure that public health is maintained, how would we address these issues? How do we ensure that the WHO guidelines, the standards that have been put in place are observed, but at the same time, people are not being subjected to what we are calling cruel and inhumane treatment, as Mr. Peter Kiama has rightly pointed out in the chat. I have seen you, Mr. Peter Kiama. Thank you very much for your question to the panelists in regards to, there was an apology issued, but unfortunately nothing has changed. So what next? I think because of the fact that there are a lot of questions and they're all tied in together, I want us as panelists to address ourselves to what next? What is the next step? Should we write to the Chief Justice? Should we ask for a multi-stakeholder committee to be in place to oversight some of these directives that are being cascaded by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry and the Cabinet Secretary for Interior? What are the next possible steps that we as civil society, we as Kenyans who want to uphold human rights standards should take. I think I'll allow Patrick, then Irungu, then Happy, Wangari, Betty. So Patrick, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you very much, I think, for everyone's insights and also the comments on the chat. I think I'll just address one issue that, this is how I'm seeing it, is that rightfully the COVID issue has just provided another opportunity for the police, to do what they do best, like corruption, the harassment, extortion, and everything. And going to your question of what next, I think this is an opportunity for the many actors who are here, that the whole question about accountability and enhancing the questions about police reforms and holding individuals accountability really needs to continue. And I'm sure the police reforms working group has been sized on this matter, and definitely this is much more menu on them on the table, knowing the difficulties that are there, for example, for IPOA to hold the police accountable for the suspected cases of police killings. So I think going forward is to really to put more gear in terms of the police accountability that has been measures that have been going on in the different forums. And secondly is to continue the good work that many of the organizations have been doing in terms of monitoring and documentation. Because definitely we can't have these conversations or we can't have any evidence if we don't have the data. And the data is the only one that can tell us then what's changing. And that's why for me, the presidential apology about the police and that didn't didn't help much, or even didn't discredit the situation, because it was, I think for me, it was just that there's nothing more tangible that has been pushed from that front. And lastly is to think about the whole question about our democracy as a country, as we go to post-COVID situation. Is that really, I think there's some things that have been tested in terms of restrictions of rights and also accountability. And really is to think as people in the human rights movement, what does this mean for us going forward? So I think that for me suffices.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Irungu, your comments on the same. What is the next best step? What is the way forward? The issue is here with us. What do we do?
So I think that if there was ever a time that we were called into action as citizens, and it is this time, so that we may be restrained in terms of movement, but there is a lot of information that is being circulated that is actionable. And I think calling on people to bear witness. I'm working with a number of organizations. The Happy Olal and the Social Justice Working Group have been doing a lot of monitoring work in their neighborhoods, in their communities. There's no reason why people cannot do the same thing in their communities. I mean, I think the violations are happening in all classes of neighborhoods. The second thing I think that would be critical at a time like this is really getting educated and encouraging people not to violate the social the guidelines that have come from the public health from the Ministry of Health, because in many ways those infractions not just endanger us as a country in terms of the spread of COVID-19, but they also precipitate abuse. For those cases where abuse is being precipitated by police officers, I think even if we don't see a badge or we don't have the names of those officers, we've seen some real impact of people documenting with smartphones and allowing that information to go viral. In many cases, that footage has actually led to files being opened up by the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. Some of those cases, hopefully in this coming week, will be going to court, where we've had officers that have been found guilty. It has also led to interdictions and suspensions of officers. So I think we should not lose hope at this point, but continue to take action. On the question that's been raised by Martin, I think an important question about health, surveillance of citizens. as many of you on this call will know, there is a new Data Protection Act that was finally brought into existence after pressure in the wake of the Huduma number fiasco. That act is now operational. I think it's important that we begin to look at what it says about surveillance and data privacy of citizens. At a time like this, we have already issued in an open letter to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and also to the Senate last week, we spoke about the importance of any health surveillance and observation measures needing to be consistent with the Data Protection Act. And secondly, that it has to be time bound and cannot be prolonged beyond this period. And that thirdly, we need to see a focus that is targeted only on contacts of people that have been found to be with COVID-19, not mass surveillance at this point. So it has to be designed to address the spread of the pandemic, but more importantly, to get medical assistance to those who might need it. So I would stop there and thank everybody for the opportunity to have shared both verbally, but also on the chat group. And thank you to ICJ for this excellent opportunity to brainstorm how we can keep people safe and dignified during this period.
Thank you very much, Irungu, for your insights. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on the panel. ICJ is very thankful for your time. I understand that you might step out, but in the event that you do, just know that we are very grateful as a team of panelists, as ICJ, for having you on board. And we will be this is a continuous engagement, so we will be calling upon you in future to share your insights on a few things that I believe we're all working on. So thank you very much for your insights and for making time to be one of our panelists right now. I want to also look at the chat section as we also do more or less our closing remarks, because that's what we are doing. I see that Ms. Li Fang is with us. She is in the UN Office of Human Rights, and it's important that the UN is also made abreast of this. I also note from the chat that someone has commented that this is not a Kenyan issue, that we have more countries that are affected. We have more human rights violations that are happening. So at least it's good to know that there is, how do you say it? There is, police across the board do not know how to handle this. So we might be the leaders and the change that we hope to have, that we might actually implore upon them to create relevant guidelines that seek to serve the public. So this is an interesting conversation that we are having, and I'm sure our partners from across Africa are also looking to us for some resolutions, some proposals that they might be able to even take home with them. So let's continue the conversation. Ms. Betty Okero, kindly tell us, what should we do next?
First of all, I want to, acknowledge the fact that the people who have been documenting and have been sharing information, I commend them, because most of the times, this is the one area in which we are then able to tell that we do have a problem. Having said that, it is important for us as civil society to be able to create perhaps one platform where all this information can be. And I'm saying that when I imagine that there is sort of like an app application where I've seen, sort of like a COVID witness. Kenyans have to find a place where they can channel all this information in a place where one is able to see just in one map what's happening across the whole country. We will not stop, we must continue. The other thing also is that we've got to tell the government that people are not the enemy. It's not the people who are the problem. The problem we have is COVID. We must be able to figure out how we want to address COVID in a way that the people that are now being quarantined because they are out of the house at 7:05 have got to become players in trying to defeat the pandemic that we have. The other issue for me is that we must continue documenting. Kenyans have to continue documenting. We've got to get our facts right. For me, this is the time when civil society have to come up and then take up the vacuum that's been created. There is a complete and total absence of our elected leaders. And in their place, we have allowed the state, the security, to take over that space. They are controlling whether we talk, they're controlling how we move, and they're doing that not because they're interested in protecting the other or trying to prevent the transmission, because now we're seeing it's become a social enterprise. So civil society has to take up that place so we can engage with citizens. And for citizens, we must be able to now come together and acknowledge when it is wrong, we have to work together. I think yesterday's action by citizens, where they demanded that the police must release this young boy because he wasn't wearing his mask, whether it was not that he was not wearing his mask properly, that sort of action needs to take place across the country. Because until citizens get up and say, this is unacceptable, and they're able to use exactly the same law that they're using to be able to arrest them, then we shall continue to see this. But we need to take up that space. We need to take it up. We need to sensitize the communities. We need to work with them. We need to record. Perhaps one of the things we have to ask ourselves is it possible for us to then start having monthly or weekly reporting about the cases that are being seen? But finally, I'd like to be able to address the governors. Our governors have a duty and responsibility to protect the constituents. That is their mandate. And this mandate right now requires that they come in to protect the citizens against the sort of violations that we're seeing happening. They need to be able to demand that the citizens who they say they're representing must be protected against the sort of brutality that we're seeing witnessed across all the whole counties. We need to see their voices, we need to see their presence, we need to see them act. Mombasa has shown us that it is possible. All the other counties must ensure that they're able to say that you will not arrest people because they don't have a mask, because I have given you a mask to give to those who don't. Cops have got to start learning how to negotiate and speak with citizens. This is not a crime where you need to take people. It's not supposed to be about embarrassing Kenyans. It's not about humiliating them. We're supposed to be getting over this together, and we need to be able to figure out how that's going to work together.
I really appreciate what you've just said, because this is not the time to humiliate Kenyans. This is not the time to oppress Kenyans. This is the time to band together and fight COVID-19. We are not fighting against each other. We are fighting a common enemy, and the enemy is the disease. So I really appreciate what you've said. I've also taken note of the shared platform whereby we can be able to engage and host information about what's happening, access to information, security reform, health directives. All this information needs to be somewhere hoisted that every single person, a Kenyan, as litigant, a civil society actor, a human rights defender can access. So we have taken that under consideration, and I think it's a wonderful suggestion. As we go to Happy Olal, I'd like to first hear from Mombasa. We have Ms. Zaina Kombo. Kindly speak to the panelists and also share your thoughts on the discourse. Ms. Zaina, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, and thank you so much for this. We have seen a lot of police brutality, and not just to ordinary citizens, but even the medical staff themselves. And I've just been wondering, because as much as we talk about, the courts have really gone low in terms of services, but what can we do as individual citizens to hold security sector to account? What can we do as individuals, leave alone organizations, leave alone, because I mean, right now we are busy trying to fight COVID-19, but the security apparatus are somehow fighting us, and we don't have that energy. I think we need to really drive our energy to one war, which is the war against COVID-19, and not really fighting police brutality right now.
All right, thank you for your comment. I appreciate that, and it is true. How can we engage every single person in this movement, in this fight? How do we ensure that it's not only us, but Kenyan citizens are taking up the mantle? I see that some of the ways in which Kenyans and the citizens are generally participating is the refusal for unlawful arrest. What we saw in Kisumu is Kenyans taking up the mantle. So how do we ensure that we empower Kenyans to do that more without necessarily causing for civil unrest? No, just saying that this is the law, I understand the law, and I wish to see the law through. How do we ensure that that is what is happening in our country? Thank you very much for your comment, Ms. Zainab. I think now I will have Mr. Olal. I think that's a very targeted question and response to you. How do we empower citizens to take up the mantle?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question and for the opportunity to be a panelist. I think the best way to empower citizens is we have not, as a sector, we have not done a lot of public education in terms of even the laws that Irungu was saying. I am not sure even our police officers are aware of which laws they are using to arrest people who don't have masks. I'm not sure if they know. So I think public education is important. You'll need to find a way to educate the public on their rights during this COVID-19 situation. We need to help them understand that the Constitution has not been suspended and the Bill of Rights is still in existence, so that more action, more citizen-oriented actions will suffice in that people already know what is happening. So for me, another key point is the citizen journalism that has been going on, where someone just take the phone and capture this moment. I think that is a very important aspect that we should encourage. If you see an interesting activity going on, just take off your camera and do it and share. I think we've done a lot of advocacy with the videos that were taken by people we don't know. So that should be encouraged. On the sector, I think we need to have a coordinated way of even doing our work as a civil society sector, because you'll find that so many things are happening, but they are not well coordinated. So I agree with Betty on the aspect of coordinated documentation. Even those people who are doing gender-based violence, is there a hub where it's a coordinated, we know, like I've seen someone share a case from Nyeri. Are we sure that that case will be taken, you see? So if we have a coordinated civil society approach to COVID-19, so we know clearly who is doing what, if it's gender-based violence, not forgetting our health workers, our frontline health workers. We have been congratulating them, but we have not listened to them. Most of them are speaking about lack of the protective gears for their work. Most of them are speaking about police harassment in their roadblocks. Most of them are speaking about trying to show the police that they are doctors, but they still harassed. So these are things that we should bring out. And we can only do this if we are coordinated, so that if we agree that we'll be doing a weekly press statement, it is a statement that encompasses all of us, not disjointed where everyone is doing their own stuff. Like in the LSK case, if we can come together for those who have been monitoring these human rights violations and police conduct, I think we can beef up such a case with a lot of data and a lot of information. So for my call is, one, we educate the public. Two, we look at our medics. Three, we do what have I said, the third one? Yeah, so I've forgotten, sorry. The other important aspect is the emergency. We've seen cases where people have lost, there's that woman who lost the kid, she was due. But because of the fear for police, people cannot go out even if they have emergency. So how do we help people like those? Do we have, what is a way forward in a situation like this, when someone fell sick at night and they need to go to the hospital? But now the fear is when you go out your house, you will meet the police and you will suffer more injuries. So more people just accept that maybe we just stay up to morning and then we go to hospital in the morning. But this is an emergency. So we need to help our communities, educate them that if you have an emergency, this is what you should do. If you are arrested without a mask, this is what you should. I like to appreciate finally all the organizations that are helping the citizens, like to get food. I know a group of lot of organizations have done that. Get even just distributing masks and sanitizers. I think that is what the government should have done first, because once you don't have money to buy masks and you are arrested for not having masks, that is criminalization of poverty, surely. So the coordinated advocacy way, I think, will be the key, because right now we don't have an opposition. And if the civil society is well coordinated, we can take up that space and help the citizen. So for us, we'll continue documenting human rights violations. And if there is anyone who is facing violations, we'll encourage them to come out, so that even if justice will not come now, I think we can still pursue justice. And the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, IPOA, and those organizations mandated to, given some mandate by law to assist in this work, I just request them to up their game and help coordinate us, so that we also do this with hiding under their mandate, so that we can reach the citizens and help them. That's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Happy Olal. Thank you very much for your insights and the possible way forward from this conversation. I want to ask a certain lady who I know was in quarantine, not the police quarantine, but quarantine because she had traveled, to talk about the mental impact it had and what challenges quarantine poses, so that as we speak of quarantine and ask people to be taken to quarantine because they have circumvented the curfew, we have an understanding of what it is that quarantine actually means. So I'll welcome June to the conversation. June, are you with me?
Hi, can you hear me?
A little bit. Do you mind turning up your volume?
Okay, just give me 1 second. Just turning it up right now. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Try again, please.
Yes.
All right, it's better now.
All right, okay. So if I could just kindly ask, just repeat the questions that you wanted me to cover.
I wanted to just find out what quarantine, not because of police arrest, but because you had come from a foreign country and as per regulation, you had to go to quarantine. But you see that many people are calling for persons who have circumvented the curfew to be taken to quarantine. But it would be important for us to know what quarantine actually feels like from someone who has experienced firsthand what it means to be in quarantine. So maybe you can shed a bit of light in respect to how quarantine is, just to paint a picture of what 14 days in isolation is.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute. So I was actually part of the people who came into the country in March, and I had an extended quarantine period at a government facility. So I was in quarantine for more than 30 days, actually, not 14. So to paint a picture of what exactly transpires in our quarantine center, I'll walk you through my stay from the moment that I arrived. I'll give you an idea of the daily routine. I'll highlight areas that perhaps the government can improve, so that anyone who's held at a quarantine center in the future can perhaps benefit from these improvements. So essentially, I arrived in the country on March, and we were ferried to the government quarantine facility in a very overcrowded NYS bus that lacked ventilation. So when we arrived at the center, it was quite clear that the officials had no idea about what was going on, meaning that they hadn't prepared for our arrival. So I think the main issues that we saw when we arrived is that the bathrooms and the rooms were in a deplorable state. They had not been cleaned, and it was quite disappointing to see. So that was a very big issue that we encountered, given that we were going to share these facilities. Nonetheless, that evening, they issued all of us with brand new beddings. So when you go to a quarantine center, you're issued with beddings. We were given a pair of slippers, and we were told to select our own rooms. So later on in the course of the week, of course, the facility hired people to come and clean the bathrooms and to try and at least make the place more livable and habitable. So at least we can laud them for that. So essentially the daily routine in a quarantine center, you wake up, and please take into account that these centers have no Wi-Fi. So most people don't really have that much to do. But anyway, you wake up in the morning, they give you breakfast, and then after that, you go back to your rooms to do whatever it is you need to do. Then your temperature is checked at around 10 p.m. every day. 10 a.m. every day. Then you're given lunch. And then in the afternoon, you're free to do whatever it is that you can occupy your time with. And then you're given supper at around 6 p.m. Then you're left to do whatever you need to do in the evening. So it's a very, very kind of quiet place, and you're supposed to social distance from people. So given that there's no Wi-Fi, it's very monotonous, and it's a very quiet time. You can't really do very many constructive activities. For example, if say you had your computer in these facilities, and most people do not have their computers, so they have their phones, and they're really quite idle. So I really did not like that about those facilities, because they didn't give us Wi-Fi and people couldn't do other things. So I think for me, the main thing that I guess I can highlight is probably the main issues being in the quarantine center. So the biggest, as has been mentioned by quite a number of panelists, is the lack of clear communication on a number of things, particularly, for example, when we got our test, when we were tested for the first time, we didn't get our results, and they just gave us an edict saying that everyone who was in the center was negative and anyone who had been taken out was positive. So there's very poor communication, particularly with results in these quarantine centers. There's lack of clear communication on when testing will take place. That's another thing. There's generally just lack of clear communication on when you're expected to leave and what the protocols are. There's lack of communication on the payment status. So I can imagine that anyone else who's going to quarantine will still experience these issues. Essentially, when we were there, most of our information came from the outside world. We had to rely on news, we had to rely on social media, and we were in a complete blackout, and it was very, very crippling and debilitating. Then another thing is that in the quarantine centers, we have people who come to clean and say maybe cut the grass, and security guards, and they interact with us, and then they go home every evening. So they're not tested for COVID. So of course you have the issue where these people could come in and bring the disease, or they could pick the disease from the people there. So that for me was a serious issue. And then the other thing, of course, is just generally in government facilities, most of the things are shared. So there's really a failure to isolate people effectively. We're not really following WHO quarantine center standards. So going forward, if you have people who perhaps are arrested for flaunting curfew and brought into quarantine centers, which we have all had is actually quite illegal, they would then be subjected to being exposed to even more dangerous conditions and being more likely to actually get the disease, because they're using shared facilities and things like that. And then, as mentioned repeatedly, there's failure to adequately address mental health. This is such a big thing. Like at some point in the quarantine center, I felt like I was going crazy. I remember when they slapped us with the third round of 14 because they extended our quarantine twice. And we didn't even learn it from our managers at the quarantine center. We learned it from the news or social media. I woke up that morning and I cried like I've never cried before. I really did not understand what was going on. I had tested negative 3 times and they just slapped this edict. So essentially nobody at that time was looking at my mental health, and I was really, really distraught. And you see, as mentioned, there's no Wi-Fi. So people are generally just really thinking about things in their lives. They're thinking about the amount of money they have to pay at the end of this. They're thinking about the families who they haven't seen in a while. So there's serious mental health and nobody is addressing it at the centers. But I do have to say that towards the end of our stay, towards the end of my more than 31 days, around day 25, 28, they gave a list of numbers you could call if you had any mental health problems. And upon calling these numbers, what transpired for me was that they weren't actually offering counseling. They were just asking for me personally to report people who I thought were perhaps flaunting social distancing, which I felt was extremely wrong. You know, because I'm here, I'm calling so that you can help me out to deal with the fact that I'm in this place, but you know. So essentially, those are the issues that I identified. So maybe going forward, if the government could address that in quarantine centers, it would really, really help. Yeah, so quarantine is a very tough time, and I don't think it should be used as a punishment tool for people who are caught flaunting curfew, because it's not it's not a conducive place. And I think maybe one more thing is that I feel like once these people who are caught flaunting curfew are taken to quarantine centers, they should be tested immediately because they don't need to stay in these places. And the problem, as Betty Okero highlighted, is that some people are even tested after 12 days and they are in quarantine for that long. And I don't think that's necessary. And then when you have such people who perhaps really are COVID negative being put in these centers, there's a higher potential to expose these people to the disease in cases where quarantine facilities are not properly managed. So that is a concern of mine. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to comment. And I hope that things change in the way quarantine centers are handled and how people who are found flaunting curfew are treated. Thank you, Julie, and thank you to the panelists.
Well, can I just add one thing just before you go? When as she was talking, the other issue around quarantine that is so depressing is that sometimes you go into a village and just hold people. You don't care whether they have children. Some of them are diabetic, have got pre-existing conditions. They're not allowed to take any medicine. And so they go to these places. And when they now start demanding for drugs, they're told they have to pay for them. So even the way this thing is done is like as though you have come to arrest a person who has broken some law, which is not just that you don't have a mask or that you're outside your door 2 minutes after 7, but it's done in such a way that there's absolutely no context to this human being. And so for me, the notion that we are just grabbing people without understanding their history is something that needs to be addressed. Apart from the fact that we now know that it is illegal, but even when you are taking others to quarantine, there has got to be a way in which you prepare this person that we are coming to collect you. Is there anything you need to carry? Because some people just go with what they have on, and that's it. They're stuck with it for the whole time that they're there. And they are forced to now have to spend their money to be able to, to have some sense of dignity.
All right, thank you very much, June, for shedding light on what it means to be in quarantine. I think now with that understanding, and I hope that a few enforcers and government officials were listening to that, because with that understanding, you then understand what are you subjecting a Kenyan to go through because they did not pay a bribe to go home? What are you putting Kenyans through because they were out past their door at 7:10? Because they went to get medication for their wife who is ailing. These are some of the conversations and the context that we need to put. We can't just say quarantine without looking at quarantine in terms of these are people who will be told to stay in a specific area for 14 days because of something that ideally could have gone before the courts and recourse could have been gotten before the courts before they are then detained. I think that highlights the need for due process. If you're going to go into a 14-day quarantine, then there needs to be due process followed to ensure that you are there with requisite preparation, as Ms. Betty said, because you cannot be expected to go into a lockdown of 14 days without even a change of clothing because you were arrested outside your house. So thank you very much, June, for shedding light on what quarantine actually is. Thank you very much, Betty, for actually attempting to humanize the person who is arrested at that time, because that's what we need to do. We need to look at people as people. We need to humanize the person and not look at them as curfew violators. This is a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, someone who was outside. What do we do with them? How do we engage with them? And I think as we wrap up, the Law Society of Kenya, Ms. Wangari, having heard what everyone is saying, having heard the different challenges, how then do we, what is the next step? Should we engage the Chief Justice for proper guidelines around how to deal with COVID, curfew, the regulations? Should we propose maybe that multi-stakeholder forum to discuss these issues? Or should we have bilaterals with the various ministries as law society, as civil society, to talk to them so that we are part of the conceptualization of these laws? It hasn't been lost on me that some of the penalties that are prescribed are 20,000 shillings for not wearing a mask. Some people genuinely cannot afford that. So we have then criminalized poverty because 6,000 is the standard bail, according to Mr. Olal. So what does that mean for someone who cannot afford this standard bribe out? Does that mean we're criminalizing people because they are poor? So I think in wrapping, you can talk about that as we attempt to wrap up. I wish to thank all our discussants. The chat has been very active. I'm really appreciative of the chat being very active. I see our panelists have also been responding to various questions posited on the chat. So thank you very much on that. There is also the Twitter forum that has been very lively. I can see that we have engaged on all forms of social media. So I like the embrace of technology as we have a very difficult conversation. So I think now we can begin wrapping up. I think all the panelists can now just wrap up. We had done wrap up for Mr. Happy Olal and Mr. Betty Okero. So in case you have any other comment that you want to do just after Ms. Kagai and Mr. Patrick go on, you can add on that. But I think we'll have wrap up from Ms. Kagai and Mr. Mutai next.
Okay, thank you, Julie. As LSK, I think as a representative of LSK, the recommendations, just to wrap up on this whole conversation and to answer Zaina's question and all the questions that have been posed through the chat, the first, I would recommend a multi-stakeholder approach, just as you proposed. It will take a concerted effort by all the players for us to combat this pandemic and emerge successfully on the other side and resume normal operations. For a start, I'd like to appeal as a recommendation to the government to put in place policies and issue executive orders that will complement the directives issued. It's one thing to say that all citizens must wear masks in public places, and it's a completely other thing to expect them to adhere to these directives, given that some might be of limited capacity to afford these masks. So if you're issuing a directive, first of all, in creating those directives, involve members of the public, include everybody, and consider all possible scenarios that would inform this directive so that they can be implemented effectively. Because what we've seen is some of these directives do not complement the situation on the ground and therefore become very unfair and are very susceptible to abuse by the enforcement agencies. So I urge the government to provide directives that are able to be implemented effectively and that take into consideration the socioeconomic circumstances of everybody. For example, if you give a directive that everybody should wear masks in a public place, then provide those masks for free if they come at a cost. I mean, if you subject everybody who is suspected to be COVID-19 positive to quarantine, then it behoves the government itself to incur, or rather to accommodate the cost of that particular directive, because not everybody will be able to afford 2,000 a night for 14 nights at a quarantine facility, whether if subjected to the facility via contact tracing or whether upon arrest. So it behoves the government to use the resources that it has now to concentrate all the resources towards facilitating the directives that it issues. And it should take into consideration all the socioeconomic implications while issuing these directives in the first place. Secondly, to the IGP and to the Kenya Police Service, I'd urge the IGP to dispatch clear guidelines to its enforcement units, setting out parameters within which they should enforce the curfew. And towards this, they should not militarize enforcement. I think this pandemic has affected all of us equally. Even the police are involved. They have families, they have dependents. So the police, the IGP should take upon itself to ensure that in sending officers out to enforce these directives, first of all, they consider the public health safety, give guidelines that will ensure officers enforce these guidelines in a way that will protect public safety, which is the essence of the curfew in the first place. Second of all, protect the officers themselves. We've seen scenarios, we've been seeing on television that even the police officers themselves are not well equipped. They're not protected in terms of, you know, how they enforce these directives. They don't have protective gear. They do not have masks. So protect both the police officers, issue guidelines that protect both police officers and both members of the public during enforcement of this curfew. Internal Affairs Unit, Police Working Group, and IPOA, all the duty bearers that keep police officers accountable, should also ensure that they hold all errant police officers accountable if they are found to be breaching human rights during this really critical time. They should try to be as friendly as possible. It's now called the Kenya Police Service for a reason. It's because it's supposed to serve the citizens as opposed to using force. So they should all adhere to the laws in place and to the constitution in enforcing the directives. To the citizens also, these directives have been put in place to protect all of us. And we should know that individual rights have to be balanced against everybody else's rights, you know, universal rights. So we have to also play our part in ensuring that we adhere to the directives as best as possible. In the exceptional circumstances where you need probably to be away from your dwellings outside of the curfew period, contact. I have seen at least there've been some efforts by government. I saw yesterday a hotline was provided for expectant mothers who might be caught up after curfew hours and need emergency care, or even sick people. You can reach out. You can reach out to some of these hotlines that are provided, even by the LSK, and highlight your exceptional circumstances, and some interventions might be made in your favor. To the CSOs and NGOs, continue tirelessly working on legal aid and providing all possible interventions through pro bono. To the judiciary and NCAJ, keep reviewing the directives that have been issued to just try as best as possible to respond to the emerging issues in a timeliest manner, because we need to rise to the occasion more than ever at this point. And to the donors, kindly grant CSOs and all players grants at this point to respond to the emergencies. And you know, we have infrastructural challenges. We need to upscale our operations at this point, and we are relying heavily on donors to fund our operations. Psychosocial services, all providers kindly reach out through CSOs, through the Law Society of Kenya, to provide very essential psychosocial support to the people affected by this pandemic, and indeed to everybody, because this pandemic has affected each and every one of us. Thank you so much for having us, ICJ, Julie, and all the panelists. Thank you for the enriching discussions. Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you, Ms. Kagai. I'll quickly move to Patrick just to give closing remarks, and then I will invite the ICJ Executive Director, Mr. Abdul Nur Mohammed, to give closing remarks as we conclude this wonderful discussion. So thank you, Patrick. Do give your closing remarks. 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's to appreciate everyone's commitment to this, and for me would be to say that continue, doing the good work that I think everyone is doing, listening in to the comments, even from and the chats from the other people, is to really continue pushing in these questions about accountability for the police violations, and also to try, as I think it was Betty who was, saying, to have much more coordination and harnessed efforts in this, because again, as I had pointed out, the COVID is, it's going to come and go. Another situation will come, and we'll have the same, the same discussions about the police responses to this. So I think for me is to encourage everyone to continue doing the good work that they are doing. Unfortunately, as I know, as you had pointed out, is is quite a lack of leadership in this, in this issue, not even from the governors, from the executive and everyone. And that really speaks to, in a sense, where we are as a country. Because in such a moment is when you need quite some guidance and really showing how we are going to tackle this. But that definitely also speaks to where we are as a country and offers a point for reflection. And thank you very much, ICJ, for the invitation, and I hope to participate in others.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patrick. Thank you very much to all our panelists. I think you have all done a great service to the conversation. Thank you to our discussants on the question and answer section. Thank you to all the participants who have been here. I now wish to call upon Mr. Abdul Nur Mohammed to give short remarks on behalf of the Kenya section of the International Commission of Jurists. Abdul, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Julie, for your excellent moderation of this webinar. And thank you, Irungu, Betty, Wangari, and Patrick for being such informative panelists. And thank you to all the participants who joined in. As you all know, at ICJ Kenya, we work on all areas of human rights, good governance, and the rule of law. And we do this working very closely with other civil society organizations, with the judiciary, with the Law Society of Kenya, with the government, and with our community of jurists. Both at the Secretariat and together with the ICJ Kenya Council, we are in contact almost daily to see how we can be responsive, and helpful to the fields during this time of COVID-19. Security sector governance and reform is only one of the many portfolios that we work on. My colleague Julie is the head of that portfolio. Through the Police Reforms Working Group, in which we are together with Amnesty International Kenya, IMLU, Haki Africa, the Social Justice Working Group, we're in close contact, working together to see how we can better help the police to respond in a human rights way. This is the third of ICJ Kenya's webinars. Last week, we had a webinar on legal practice and access to justice under COVID-19, which was led by Silas Kamanza. Earlier this week, we discussed our work on legal aid and how it is being affected in this period, and that was led by Santana Simiyu. Next week, we hope to have another webinar on justice and also how COVID-19 is affecting the right to health and the right to education. So we want to thank all the panelists who've worked with us, all the partners who have come and at such short notice, and to our members who participate in these webinars. Most of all, I would like to thank the Council of ICJ Kenya for their ideas and the support they give the Secretariat to make this happen. Lastly, I would like to thank Lawyers Hub for letting us use their platform and for being such good members for ICJ Kenya. Asanteni.
All right. And with that, I wish to say that we have come to the end of the third of many webinars to come. Do continue engaging us on our various social media platforms and continue walking the talk. It's been a pleasure moderating this session. My name is Julie Wayua Madeka, and now I wish to say have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.